Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome back to Access to Democracy. Alan Miller, your host, and a return guest who just advised me, because I thought that we had started this show 14 years ago in 2001, that he was a guest here in 2000. Another studio, another lifetime.
In a galaxy far, far away.
Yes, Associate Justice David Lillehaug.
Good to be back with you.
Minnesota Supreme Court, who was appointed. He's the new kid on the block in the Supreme Court, appointed.
I'm 16 months old now. I guess that's,
I was going to say
still pretty
last
young.
year by the governor, but in the position where you have to run for election.
That is true.
Something that I discussed with another justice that I'm very opposed to. When you have a justice and a justice.
You're opposed to what? Not that justice,
judges,
I hope.
Forcing judges to run for election. I think they should be selected by a nonpartisan group, appointed by the governor, fine. But I don't think a judge should be lumped in as another politician, because they're not politicians and you are not a politician. And your job is much more important, frankly.
Well, you know, I'm in the position where, being on the Minnesota Supreme Court, my job is to interpret and apply the Minnesota Constitution and the laws. So I'm not going to give you an opinion on how judges should be selected. But what I do know is the Minnesota Constitution provides for elections. It is a nonpartisan election. You don't see an R or a D on anyone's name on the ballot. And I believe judicial elections should continue to be nonpartisan. You wouldn't want to go into court for one of the most important moments of your life and feel you're going to have a ruling for or against you because you're a Republican or a Democrat. That's not the way the judicial system is supposed to work. It's the executive branch and the legislative branch that are the political branches of the government, and you've had a lot of politicians on the show. Judges are not political, and they can't be political, and that's why judicial elections should remain nonpartisan.
And that's the way it should be, if in fact there have to be elections at all. I think that a judge who has served admirably on the bench should just be reappointed, yay or nay. If there are reasons not to reappoint them, that's fine. If not, re-elect them.
You know, I've been thinking about how they do it at the federal level. And at the federal level, the president nominates someone for a judgeship. And then the U.S. Senate, under its advice and consent power under the U.S. Constitution, will confirm. I became U.S. Attorney that way. I was nominated by President Clinton and then confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. The problem is, though, if you've got partisan gridlock in Washington, then all these nominations become a product of partisan wrangling. And so we've seen what's happened on that in the last few years. So I used to think that was probably the best system. Now I'm just not so sure.
Well, maybe I'll have to work out a compromise system and present it.
The Miller Plan.
Why not?
For judicial selection.
Why
I will await it with great interest.
In the meantime, you said something very interesting just as we were about to go on the air about how you wake up every day so eager to get to the court, which would indicate you're really enjoying what you're doing.
I love my work on the Minnesota Supreme Court. It's been 16 months. Every morning I'm excited to get up and go to work. I still get a little shiver when I'm driving up to the Capitol. And by the way, the Capitol's under renovation right now, so we can talk about that a little bit too if you want to. But I work in the Minnesota Judicial Center, which used to be the Minnesota Historical Building. It's just to the right of the Capitol as you're facing the Capitol.
Martin Luther King Boulevard.
Martin Luther King Boulevard. And I'll tell you, it was just a true honor to be appointed by the governor to be on the Minnesota Supreme Court. And I feel good about it. I feel I'm contributing to the public service, and that I have a tremendous public trust that I think about every day.
Well, it was not only, as you say, an honor, it was a well-deserved honor.
Well, bless you.
Because, and I think, really, looking at the people who have endorsed you and the organizations who have endorsed you, that becomes self-evident. Just about any organization that has anything to do with the law has endorsed your election.
Well, you're right, Alan. I'm going to be on the ballot on November 4, and it's a challenge to run for election when you're a sitting judge. There are various constraints, both by law and that I put on myself. I don't want running for judicial office to be equivalent to a political race, because the moment you get politics and dueling political parties involved in judicial elections, things go very, very bad. What I do have the benefit of, though, is having worked with and connected with people all over the state. And those who are in the best position to know who should be on the Supreme Court, I think, are former Chief Justices and Justices of the Minnesota Supreme Court. I am fortunate that they are for me. I'm also fortunate to have the support of people like Vice President Walter Mondale, former Speaker of the House Steve Swigum, U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar. These are people who follow the judiciary very closely, and they also have a commitment to a nonpartisan
How
judiciary.
about some of the bar associations, all of which seem to back you
Well, I got
wholeheartedly?
I got some really good news the other day. The Minnesota State Bar Association had what's called a plebiscite. It's essentially a straw poll. And they had three kinds of lawyers vote: civil litigators, criminal litigators, and appellate lawyers vote. And I got more than 93% of the vote. I mean, you can barely get a 93% vote for the idea that the sun's going to rise in the east in the morning. So I was immensely gratified that the people who are in the best position to know about justices on the Minnesota Supreme Court are very much for me.
And yours is an unusual race this year in that you do have an opponent, and that opponent has generated a lot of publicity. Adverse it may be, it has put her name forward in the press and on television a lot because of some personal problems that she has had. But it's still, you know, they say bad press is still good press. So
well, I'm certainly hoping that's not the case. I do have an opponent. She made what, in my judgment, was a very serious mistake in getting involved with the party endorsing process. And that has not worked out so well either for her or for the party that chose to endorse her, perhaps
and
with
then
some
tried to
inaccurate
unendorse her.
Yeah, see, this just proves my point that the moment political parties get involved in judicial elections, it's bad for everybody. And most importantly, it's bad for the institution of the judiciary and bad for justice. So, you know, they have that problem. But putting that completely aside, I'd rather be elected not on any issues that my opponent has, but on a couple of things. My background and experience in both civil practice and as a former United States attorney, and then my performance on the court. I've been on the court 16 months. That's long enough for people to at least start to evaluate my performance. And the best measure of that are people who have been on the court and think I should continue.
You probably appeared before the court more than most lawyers do in their entire career.
Well, certainly in recent years,
as a prosecutor and certainly as a civil litigator.
Well, I didn't appear before the Minnesota Supreme Court as a prosecutor. I was the United States attorney, so I was appearing in the U.S. district courts in Minnesota.
It's experience.
But I certainly coming on to the Minnesota Supreme Court, I knew the court well. I had appeared before the court. I had studied the court for outside national law firms that had cases before the Minnesota Supreme Court. And you know, through the big cases that I had, especially in the last few years, I started thinking to myself, I think I could perform a public service by sitting there. And so that's why when Justice Paul Anderson retired, I threw my hat in the ring. I applied to be on the Minnesota Supreme Court.
Big shoes to fill.
Oh. Yeah, I just had breakfast with him this morning, and I know he was a frequent guest on your show and holds you in very high regard. So I applied, was interviewed by the Judicial Selection Commission. They did a thorough background check. Same thing had happened when I became the U.S. Attorney, and then recommended me to the governor, who selected me.
And here we are.
And here we are.
And you still got to run and win this election. So.
Yes, and I'm not complaining about having to be on the ballot. Alan, it was in the job description when I applied for the job. I knew about that. I knew that I would be on the ballot. And so what I'm trying to do is campaign in a way that befits the dignitary of the judiciary and connect with people all over the state. For example, just yesterday, I spent most of the day in New Ulm, Minnesota. I visited the county attorney's law office. I visited the courthouse. Went to the newspaper, one of the radio stations, and then spoke to the Lions Club. It was a great day. I just love being in greater Minnesota and connecting with people all over the state.
This is a big state to cover, however.
It is. It's a statewide election. And there will be a number of people who don't vote in Supreme Court races. Did you know from the top of the ticket, governor, senator, down to the first Supreme Court race, there's a 25% drop-off in
I would
voters.
have guessed it was more than that.
But I'm in the second Supreme Court race, and so there's an additional drop-off. Sometimes people come to the first race and just say, the heck with it. So what I'm trying to do is acquaint people on two things. One, get to know who the candidates are for the Minnesota Supreme Court. You can do that through newspaper voter guides. You can do it by checking out websites. But the best way to do it, if you're wondering about something like that, talk to the people who have some expertise. Talk to friends and neighbors who are lawyers. And if people do that, I will be overwhelmingly endorsed because lawyers know about my background and experience, and from every indication believe that I'm doing a good job on the Minnesota Supreme Court.
What's been the most difficult case to come before you since you on the court?
Well, I think I won't identify a specific case, but as a category of cases, first-degree murder cases are the most difficult. Often the facts of the crime are, any murder is horrible, but first-degree murder cases, sometimes the facts are especially horrible. I mean, we had a case the other day where the briefs described the multiple knife wounds. The victims and their families are something foremost in my mind. But you know what else is in my mind, even in the most horrible cases? My mind is on the integrity of the criminal justice system, that we put the burden on the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, no matter what kind of crime it is. My mind is on the constitutional guarantees provided by the U.S. Constitution and the Minnesota Constitution. That even somebody charged with a terrible, terrible crime, they have rights. They have rights to know what the charges are, rights to counsel, and rights to have the evidence that's submitted in the case be evidence of integrity.
I started to say, in some cases, the Minnesota Constitution is more liberal than the federal Constitution.
I wouldn't use the word liberal. I would use the word more protective of rights, the phrase more protective of rights than the U.S. Constitution.
That's a better choice of words, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think constitutional rights deserve labels like liberal or conservative. I think our founders, both federal and state, had a great genius for understanding that we want government to prosecute crimes. But when somebody's life or liberty is at stake, their rights must be respected. And it's the role of the judiciary both to administer cases fairly. Serious crimes deserve serious time. But at the same time, when somebody is charged with a crime where they can lose their life and liberty, there cannot be government overreach. We need to have a fair system.
And we see a lot today, I see anyway, where some of the rights in the Bill of Rights are under attack or become eroded. And it's a changing situation. I don't think it should be a changing situation. I think that has happened over the years. Federally, it has been. I don't think that has been the case in the states.
The great danger in our nation's history, and we've seen this over and over, is when the country is in a time of crisis, then we start to think the Constitution can be sidestepped. It can never be sidestepped. In fact, the very existence of the United States of America is strengthened when we honor rights. And again, we go back to the pretty elementary principle you learn when you're in 5th grade. We got 3 branches of government. We got the executive and legislative branches. Those are the political branches. We've got the judiciary, which must remain non-political and must adhere to the requirements of the United States and Minnesota constitutions. And that provides the kind of protection so that when government does overreach, there is somebody there to say, no, these rights and liberties are eternal and they will be protected.
Now, the governor, at the time of your appointment, said that you have one of the keenest minds of anyone he has ever encountered. I hear that passion and that energy in you now, and obviously your flavor for the job has not diminished at all in 13 months. If anything, it has expanded.
Make that 16 months. Don't lose
16
those
months.
extra 3 months.
16 months. It has expanded.
Yeah, one of the great things about being on the Minnesota Supreme Court is not only the opportunity for public service, but it is kind of a feast for somebody who loves the law and loves to apply legal precedent and legal principle. You know, lawyers in private practice, some of them carve out a narrow niche, and they learn everything possible, and they become maybe the best lawyers in the world in that narrow niche. I respect that, but I was never that kind of lawyer. I've done a lot of things over my legal career. As a prosecutor, I've defended white-collar and regulatory offenses, done things like construction, real estate litigation, some family law, some probate, that sort of thing. So I have a mind that likes to connect different areas of the law and see what the common threads are between those areas. And that's one of the great things we have the opportunity to do on the Minnesota Supreme Court. Probably more than 50% of our docket is criminal, but there are different kinds of criminal cases and different criminal issues. On the civil side, we've got family law cases, personal injury, business litigation, juvenile protection, a lot of different kinds of cases, and I find them intellectually very interesting, and I'm passionate about my work.
When you were in the U.S. Attorney's Office, one of the things that marked your tenure there was the fact that you brought more diversity to that office than it had ever known previously.
That is true.
And that probably is a mark that you left that has been carried forward since that time.
You know, they say that whether for the U.S. Attorney's Office or any other major management position like that, you can have an impact during your time in office, but the biggest impact is the people that you hire and leave behind. And I'll claim I'm pretty darn proud of that record. A number of the people that I hired have become judges and justices. A number of people that I worked with in that office have become managers in the office. And now the current United States Attorney, Andy Lugar, is somebody that I worked with very closely back in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I didn't hire him, my predecessor did, but I could tell from, in the first 5 minutes I was talking to him back in 1993. That this was a guy who was going to be a great prosecutor and was going places, and now he's in charge of the U.S. Attorney's Office and I think doing a magnificent job.
From everything I read, he is doing that.
He has that office's sea legs back. They are focused, not just in drug and narcotics crimes, but in white-collar crimes. His background is as a white-collar prosecutor. And that's the place where the federal government is indispensable. It's very, very difficult for our county attorneys to deal with white-collar crimes that cross jurisdictional lines, or that maybe even be national in scope. But the United States Attorney, with the resources of the FBI, the postal inspectors, and all the federal alphabet soup agencies, they can do that work, and Andy Lugar can do that work.
As you did before him, and left a very fine reputation behind.
Whether it's individuals or corporations, everybody needs to be equal, and sometimes corporations are seen to be people. Everybody needs to be equal in the eyes of the law.
So, you are a pheasant hunter?
I am. I get really excited at this time of year to go pheasant hunting. As I was driving to New Ulm yesterday, I was seeing the corn drying in the fields and the blue stem prairie grass going brown. And I hunt in 2 places. My family's got the old homestead, 80 acres out in South Dakota. And I think this will be my 28th straight year out there. And then my brother and I have some land near Montevideo, Minnesota. And it's a beautiful piece of land. with Blue Stem Prairie and a SLU as well. And I like to do that. It really gets my blood flowing.
And even though you're a Harvard graduate, with honors, I might add, from the law school, you happen to be a fan of the Gophers.
I am. Well, I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and as you mentioned, I went to Harvard Law School. That was a really big move for a kid from South Dakota. And I'll admit it was kind of intimidating at first, but I worked hard and I did well in law school. Yeah, I am a fan of the Gophers. I've got season tickets for football and hope Coach Kill continues to improve that team. And the Vikings, although, you know, they're up, they're down, they're problems, they're not problems, you just never know where they're going to go.
And some personal
Our
problems
hearts have been broken so many times, Alan.
Yes. Well, I'm a Twins fan, and I grew up a Yankee fan, and my parents and I went to many Yankee games.
Did they win too often for you?
And it wasn't that they won too often for me, because everybody likes a winner. It's when we moved to Minnesota 17 years ago, and we went to the Metrodome, and there were about 8,000 or 9,000 people there. And it reminded me that the Yankees would come in, they would pull up in their Cadillac, and these sandlot kids would play them. That was the equivalent in my mind. And I just couldn't continue to root for a team that had everything going for them.
Alan, you have always been a populist. You root for the underdog, and that's
Always-
one of the
always
little
have been.
fella instead of the Rockefeller.
And got very involved with the Twins, and I'm still very involved with the Twins. And
Well, after 390 lost seasons, you continue to root for the underdog.
yeah, 4, but who's counting?
Oh, is it
It's
4? I lost track some time ago.
But in fact, you know, I have definite feelings on the selection of a new manager, and we will have some of the front
You
office
should do
people here.
you should do a show on that.
We will once the selection is made. I can't really do it in advance because Terry Ryan would never, he's so close to the vest, he would never do it. But we will, and we have Dave St. Peter in at least once a year.
Oh, good.
And people from the front office, as said, Dr. Steebs, the orthopedist, and it's branched out. Dr. Crutchfield, who's the dermatologist of the team, some vice presidents, and et cetera. And it's become sort of a hobby. And
Well, if you have the team dermatologist, then you are a true Twins fan. You've got skin in the game.
so, and we keep hoping, but like the Vikings, you know, hope, hope, hope.
Understood.
So, the court here's an argument.
Mm-hmm.
You adjourn for the conference. The judges give their opinions.
7 of us deliberate.
Is there an order in which the judges speak?
There is. A lot of things at the Minnesota Supreme Court, since it's an institution about 150 years old, are done by custom and practice. What usually happens is that one justice is primarily in charge of the case. So in the run-up to the case, everybody gets the briefs and reads the briefs, but one justice and his or her law clerk prepare what's called a bench memorandum, which is circulated to all the justices. And it is that justice then who, at the conference after the oral argument, speaks first. And then we go down the line in order of seniority and around with the Chief Justice speaking last. On my first day in the court, it was a case where the Chief Justice spoke first and voted first, and then the vote came down the line. I was at the end of the line. So I'm keeping track of the votes, 1 to affirm, 1 to reverse, 1 to affirm, 1 to reverse, and then all of a sudden it hits me. On my very first case, I might be casting the deciding vote. And I'll tell you, I knew a lot intellectually about the Minnesota Supreme Court, and I knew exactly, I think I was fully prepared to become a justice. But it was at that moment I had the visceral feeling of responsibility. You know, I could be casting a vote that could set the law in concrete for the next 100 years in the state of Minnesota. And the anticlimax to the story is the fourth vote came in before me. I ended up being in the minority and dissenting with a short opinion in my very first case, 4-3 opinion in my very first case. But it was that moment of clarity when I fully realized the great responsibility that a Minnesota Supreme Court justice has. It was interesting.
And one of the things I said when Justice Wright was here is that the court is shorthanded as budget-wise as is everybody in government at the present time. But you have, what, one law clerk and you share another one?
I do. I have one law clerk and I have a third of another law clerk. That will soon go from 1 1/3 to 1 1/2. But you know what? I never complain about the resources that the judiciary is given. Well, let me take that back. I might complain a little bit. But by and large, things have been better in the last few years. And I feel that we've got sufficient staff to do our work and do it well. The Minnesota Supreme Court is very highly regarded nationally.
It's one of the things I said to Justice Wright. When I was in law school, and as I said to her, I was back, I think Lincoln was president, but one of the things, there were 4 or 5 courts around the country that when you knew a decision came from that court, you perked up your eyebrows. It was, oh, the Minnesota Supreme Court. Well, let's pay this one a lot of credence.
Well, I'm hoping that we're still regarded that way.
And I think
nationally.
you are. I think it's been maintained through the years. And that's very important.
The way I think about it is this way. When I was a lawyer, I would cite Minnesota Supreme Court cases from the 1860s or the 1870s. If it was good law then and it hasn't been overruled, it's good law now. So what I try to do is think, what would some lawyer 100 years from now think reading one of my opinions? That lawyer might say, this Justice Lillehaug, whatever the name is, can't really pronounce the name, but the writing is clear.
Well, let's make it clear that it's Lillehaug.
Lillehaug.
And it will be number 2 on the Supreme Court ballot.
The second, my race is the second one, and my name will appear and the word incumbent will appear on the ballot. But as I mentioned, there will be no party affiliation appearing on the ballot, and that's the way that it should be.
And that is the way.
Anyway, I'm hoping a lawyer reading one of my opinions 100 years from now will say, the writing is clear, I understand it, I understand the rule of law that's being announced, and I can use that either in my brief or to advise my clients. I'm not going to be around for that. At least I don't think so.
You never know. And we have actually run through a half an hour.
It's been an absolute delight, Alan.
And we haven't really scratched the surface of all the things I have here, so obviously we'll ask you to come back in the future.
We had a good talk, and I'm always happy to come back.
It's a pleasure. And I guess we should urge people to get out and vote. That's probably the most important thing this year.
We urge people to get out and vote. And we urge people to acquaint themselves on all the judicial races, not just let them sit empty, and cast informed votes.
Justice David Lillehaug, Minnesota Supreme Court.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Be well.